Welcome to a deep dive into the world of a truly remarkable thinker, John Philoponus.
Oh, yeah, a fascinating figure.
We're going to explore his ideas in a way that I think would make sense to a fellow philosopher.
Really gonna get into the nitty-gritty.
That's right, we're going deep into the philosophical weeds.
I love it.
We're talking 6th century Alexandria,
A time
when the intellectual landscape was shifting.
Yeah, upheaval.
The Roman Empire was fading and Christianity was on the rise, leading to all sorts of new ideas and challenges to old ways of thinking.
A really exciting time to be a thinker.
Absolutely.
And that's where John Philoponus comes in.
A Christian philosopher and scientist
Who dared to question.
who dared to question the authority of the great Aristotle himself.
That took some guts.
It did.
Yeah.
He was known as John the Grammarian, or John of Alexandria,
But his nickname,
but his nickname Philoponus really captures his spirit.
lover of toil,
It means lover of toil.
really embodies that.
He truly embodied that dedication to rigorous intellectual exploration.
He was a workhorse.
And toil, he did, especially when it came to dissecting and critiquing some of Aristotle's most fundamental ideas about motion space,
Even the eternity of the world.
even the eternity of the world.
Big questions.
He wasn't afraid to roll up his sleeves and wrestle with these complex concepts.
No, he wasn't.
What's particularly fascinating is how Philoponus blended his Christian beliefs with his philosophical inquiries.
Right. You see that a lot in late antiquity.
This led him to some truly groundbreaking conclusions, but also landed him in some hot water with both philosophical and theological authorities.
Oh, yeah, he made some enemies.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. To really understand the weight of Philoponus's critiques,
Yeah.
we need to start with the world he was living in. Alexandria in the 6th century was still a bustling hub of intellectual activity, really.
Oh, absolutely.
We're not talking about some backwater.
No, Alexandria was still a major center of learning.
It was home to the famous Neoplatonic school,
Oh.
where philosophers like Ammonius Philoponus' teacher
Tried to synthesize.
tried to synthesize the ideas of Plato with later philosophical and religious influences.
A lot of that going on.
So Philoponus was steeped in this rich philosophical tradition.
He had a solid foundation.
And he actually started his career, like many others, writing commentaries on Aristotle's works.
Standard practice.
It's almost like he was mastering the language of the very system he would later challenge.
He knew it inside and out.
Precisely.
But for philosophers in late antiquity...
But these commentaries weren't just about passively explaining what Aristotle said.
Oh, no.
They were opportunities to engage in deep, critical analysis,
To refine.
to refine and develop their own ideas in conversation with the great thinkers of the past.
It was a lively debate, even if it was happening across centuries.
So Philoponus was trained to think rigorously and critically within the framework of Aristotelian thought.
But
But then he takes this incredible leap and starts to directly challenge some of Aristotle's core principles.
he goes off script.
Yes, and this shift is crucial for understanding Philoponus's impact.
I think so.
He was one of the first to really break free from the unquestioning reverence for authority that had characterized much of ancient philosophy.
It was a bold move.
He showed that even Aristotle, the towering figure of the time, wasn't infallible.
Nobody's perfect.
That's what's so exciting about Philoponus.
Yeah.
He wasn't content to just repeat what had been said before.
He was
He was a true intellectual rebel,
pushing the boundaries.
pushing the boundaries of philosophical inquiry,
And he did it.
and he did so on some truly fundamental questions.
Like motion.
Like, for instance, his critique of Aristotle's theory of motion, specifically projectile motion.
Ah, yes. The spear throwing problem.
Okay, so for our philosopher listener, let's break this down.
Let's get technical.
Aristotle believed that for an object to stay in motion, it needed a continuous force acting upon it, right?
Right. Keep pushing it.
Like if you throw a spear,
Something's got to keep it going.
something has to keep pushing it forward.
Aristotle thought that was the air.
So the air was like an invisible hand guiding the spear along its path. But Philoponus looked at this and said, wait a minute,
Hold on.
that doesn't quite add up.
Does that make sense?
Exactly. He pointed out several problems with this theory.
For example.
For example, if the air itself was pushing the spear, why would the spear eventually fall to the ground?
Shouldn't it just keep going?
Shouldn't the air keep pushing it indefinitely?
Good point.
Right. And you can see how someone with Philoponus's analytical mind would start to pick apart these inconsistencies in Aristotle's explanation.
He was sharp.
So what did he propose as an alternative?
This is where things get really interesting.
This is where his theory of impetus comes in.
A brilliant insight.
And it's truly a brilliant insight. Philoponus argued that When you throw an object,
You impart something to it.
you impart a kind of incorporeal motive force to it.
An impetus.
An impetus. This impetus is what keeps the object moving, not the air pushing from behind.
It's internal.
So it's like an internal energy
or momentum.
that the object carries within itself.
And it gradually dissipates.
And this impetus gradually dissipates, which is why the object eventually slows down and falls.
That's the key.
Precisely. This was a radical departure from Aristotelian physics.
It challenged the whole system.
It's challenged the long-held belief that motion required constant contact with the mover, and it foreshadowed the concept of inertia, which would become central to our modern understanding of motions centuries later.
Way ahead of his time.
Wow. So he was already hinting at ideas that would later be developed by Galileo and Newton.
Amazing, isn't it?
That's incredible. And Philoponus's theory of impetus wasn't just a theoretical curiosity.
No, it had.
It had practical implications as well.
Like explaining.
For instance, it helped explain why a spinning top stays upright.
Which is tricky with Aristotle's physics.
The phenomenon that was difficult to account for using Aristotle's physics.
Philoponus nailed it.
This is already blowing my mind, and we're just getting started.
We've got a lot more to cover.
But before we jump into Philoponus's other critiques of Aristotle, I want to pause and ask our philosopher listener what stands out to you about Philoponus's approach here. It's really impressive how he was able to identify these subtle but significant flaws in Aristotle's thinking and then propose a completely different framework for understanding motion.
It speaks to his intellectual rigor, his willingness to challenge even the most established dogma.
He wasn't afraid to go against the grain and follow the logic wherever it led him.
And that's what makes him such a fascinating figure in the history of philosophy.
Okay, I'm ready to delve into more of his critiques.
Like?
I'm particularly intrigued by his arguments about space and the void.
Oh, that's a good one.
This is another area where he directly confronted Aristotle's deeply entrenched ideas.
Head-on collision.
Aristotle famously rejected the very notion of a void of empty space.
He thought nature just hated it.
He believed that nature abhorred a vacuum and that space was always filled with something, even if it was just air or ether. But Philoponus, drawing on both philosophical reasoning and everyday observations, argued that a void was not only possible, but actually necessary to explain certain phenomena.
Now, how did he do that?
I'm eager to hear how he made that case.
Let's hear it.
Let's dive into those arguments.
So imagine you have a pipette.
A pipette.
A slender tube.
Used to transfer liquids.
Right. You dip it into a container of water, seal the top with your finger, and lift it.
Okay.
Some of the water stays inside the pipette suspended even though gravity is pulling it down.
Right, it's clinging there.
Aristotle would say that this happens because nature abhors a vacuum.
Right, that's the classic explanation.
So the water rushes in to fill any potential empty space.
But Philoponus wasn't satisfied with that.
No, he wanted a more precise explanation.
And this is where his philosophical rigor shines through.
He was very meticulous.
He wasn't just content with a vague idea of nature abhorring a vacuum.
He wanted to get to the underlying mechanism.
He argued that the water stays in the pipette because of the pressure of the surrounding air.
Which is greater than the weight of the water column.
So this pressure difference
prevents the water from flowing out.
Right, it's balance of forces.
And if there were no void, no empty space, how could this pressure difference even exist?
That's a good point.
The air would have nowhere to push against.
And the water would simply flow out.
Exactly.
So he's using this very practical example to challenge this deeply ingrained philosophical notion.
He's saying, look, if there's no void, how do you explain this?
How do you explain how this pipette works?
How do you explain suction?
It's brilliant.
It is,
Yeah.
and it goes even deeper than just explaining physical phenomena.
Okay.
Philoponus's conception of the void actually gets to the heart of how we understand space itself.
So we're not just talking about empty pockets here.
No, this is about the nature of space itself.
Okay.
Aristotle saw space as defined by the boundaries of objects.
So the space inside a box is literally
The inner surface of the box.
the box itself.
Yeah, but Philoponus argued that space existed independently of matter.
So space is out there, whether there's stuff in it or not.
As a kind of three-dimensional extension.
It's its own thing.
Exactly. Objects existed within space.
Rather than defining space themselves.
A huge shift in perspective.
So for Philoponus, space was more than just a container for things.
It was a fundamental reality in itself.
This is a big idea, and it has profound implications for how we think about the cosmos.
It opens up a whole new way of seeing the universe.
And this is where it gets really interesting for our philosopher listener. Because Philoponus wasn't just interested in the physical world.
He was also...
He was also deeply concerned with theological questions.
And his ideas about space had a profound impact on his understanding of God.
And creation.
Right. For Philoponus, the idea that space could exist independently of matter fit perfectly with the Christian idea of a God who created the world ex nihilo.
Out of nothing.
God didn't need pre-existing matter to shape the cosmos.
He could create both matter and space.
From his own infinite power.
So in a way, Philoponus's philosophical insights about the void actually strengthen his theological convictions.
Absolutely. He saw the world as a testament to God's boundless creativity and power.
Okay, so we've got space, we've got creation.
And now we come to another major area where Philoponus challenged Aristotle.
The question of
the eternity of the world.
Aristotle, along with many other Greek philosophers, believed that the world had always existed and would always exist.
Eternal and unchanging.
But this idea posed a fundamental problem for Christian thinkers, like Philoponus.
Right, because
The Christian doctrine of creation asserted that the world had a definite beginning
that it was created by God.
at a specific point in time,
So Philoponus set out to refute the eternity of the world,
not just on theological grounds.
but using philosophical reasoning as well.
So he's not just saying, my holy book says so.
No, he's engaging with Aristotle on his own terms.
This is a truly audacious move.
It is. He's taking on the very foundations of Aristotelian cosmology.
What were some of his key arguments?
Well, one of his most powerful arguments was based on the idea of infinity.
Infinity.
He argued that the concept of an infinite past was logically incoherent.
If the world had always existed, then every moment in the past would have been preceded by an infinite number of other moments.
And that creates a paradox.
Because how can you have an infinite number of things actually happen?
It's like trying to count to infinity.
You never actually reach the end.
Exactly. Philoponus argued that if time were truly infinite, then we could never have reached the present moment.
It would just keep going.
The very fact that we're here experiencing this present moment implies that time must have a beginning.
It's such a simple but powerful argument.
It really is.
What other arguments did he use?
He also pointed to the evidence of change and decay in the world around us.
So he's looking at the world around him.
He's saying if the world were truly eternal and unchanging, as Aristotle claimed,
Then why do things age and die?
why do stars explode and planets collide?
Why is the universe not this static, perfect realm?
He's using empirical observation to challenge this purely abstract philosophical concept,
It's almost like a proto-scientific method.
where he's looking to the natural world to test the validity of philosophical claims.
And this emphasis on observation and empirical evidence would become increasingly important in the centuries that followed.
Laying the groundwork for the scientific revolution.
But for now, we need to shift our focus to another aspect of Philoponus's work, one that's perhaps even more controversial than his critiques of Aristotle, his theological writings.
Oh, yes, we're getting into the really tricky stuff now.
All right, let's dive into those theological waters. I'm eager to hear how Philoponus applied his philosophical rigor and critical thinking to questions of faith and doctrine. This is where his commitment to loving toil really gets put to the test.
Indeed, Philoponus's theological writings are just as bold and challenging as his philosophical works.
And just as likely to spark debate and controversy.
Even today. So we've talked about John Philoponus as this incredible philosophical powerhouse, taking on Aristotle, shaking things up.
A real revolutionary.
But he wasn't just content with revising our understanding of the physical world. He also wanted to bring that same rigor, that same analytical approach to understanding the mysteries of faith.
And that's where things get really interesting.
That's where we see his philosophical training and his deep Christian convictions really come together.
Sometimes in some pretty controversial ways.
Oh, yeah. He wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers.
And one of the most controversial areas of his theological work was his view of Christology. He was a staunch supporter of monophysitism.
Which was a pretty big deal back in the 6th century.
It was a huge deal. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 had affirmed this doctrine of discernibility in two natures,
Two natures in one person.
which stated that Christ had two distinct natures, one divine and one human united in one person. But monophysites like Philoponus felt that this formulation didn't quite capture the full divinity of Christ.
They worried that by emphasizing two distinct natures, you are essentially dividing Christ into two separate beings.
And that seemed to undermine the core Christian belief in the unity of God and the unique personhood of Jesus.
Exactly. For Philoponus, the key to understanding Christology was to clarify how we use the term nature.
So we have to be really careful about our definitions here.
He argued that you could talk about nature in a general sense, like the nature of humanity or the nature of divinity.
So a kind of universal category that applies to all members of a particular group.
Right, but you can also talk about nature in a more specific individual sense, like the particular nature of a specific human being.
So what makes each individual unique, their individual essence?
Exactly. And Philoponus argued that when we talk about Christ having two natures, we can't mean that the universal natures of divinity and humanity are somehow merged in him.
Because that would imply that God the Father and the Holy Spirit also became human, since they share the same divine nature,
And that would lead to some pretty strange theological conclusions.
to say the least.
Philoponus was very careful to avoid any kind of theological incoherence.
He was trying to stay within the bounds of Orthodox Christian belief.
He insisted that what's united in Christ are the particular natures of the divine Logos and the man Jesus.
So the unique individual essence of each, but not the universal categories themselves.
And to really drive home this
He
point,
goes even further.
Philoponus equates particular nature with hypostasis.
Now that's a term that we need to unpack a bit. It's got a long history in philosophy, going back to the Neoplatonists,
It roughly means substantive existence.
and it's often used as a synonym for person.
So by linking particular nature with hypostasis,
Philoponus is saying that Christ can only have one nature, one hypostasis, because we believe he is one person.
he's trying to uphold the unity of Christ's personhood while still acknowledging the fullness of his divinity and humanity.
It's a complex and nuanced argument, and it definitely sparked a lot of debate.
It did, and it continues to be a topic of discussion among theologians today.
And this leads us to another area where Philoponus's theological views raise some eyebrows, his understanding of the Trinity,
He was accused of tritheism.
which was a pretty serious charge.
It's a big deal back then.
So to understand Philoponus's position on this, we need to remember how he understood hypostasis.
That individual concrete existence of a thing.
He saw it as analogous to Aristotle's notion of primary substance, the specific individual things that make up the world,
A particular tree, a particular dog.
a particular human being.
Right, and because the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three distinct hypostases,
Philoponus argued that they must also be three distinct substances,
this led his critics to accuse him of believing in three separate gods.
rather than one God in three persons.
They thought he was taking his philosophical categories a little too far.
Like he was trying to force this neat philosophical grid onto a mystery that transcended human understanding.
And there's definitely a tension there, a struggle to reconcile philosophical ideas with the depths of faith.
But what's so compelling about Philoponus is that he never shied away from those tough questions. He was always willing to wrestle with difficult concepts.
Even if it meant challenging established dogma and risking controversy.
It's that spirit of intellectual honesty and rigor that makes him such an important figure even today.
He reminds us that the pursuit of truth, whether in philosophy or theology, requires a willingness to question, to probe, to dig deep.
And he shows us that the boundaries between these disciplines aren't always clear-cut,
His work is a testament to the interconnectedness of faith and reason.
and how they can both illuminate and challenge each other.
Exactly. It's a dynamic interplay.
So as we wrap up our deep dives into the world of John Philoponus, I want to leave our listeners with this final thought. Philoponus's legacy is a testament to the power of critical thinking, the importance of intellectual humility, and the enduring allure of the big questions that drive human inquiry. His work, though, from centuries ago still speaks to us today, urging us to keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep loving the toil of discovery.
And remember, even when his ideas sparked controversy, they always aimed at deeper understanding and a richer engagement with both the world around us and the mysteries of faith. It's an approach that continues to inspire and challenge us centuries later.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and complex world of John Philoponus. We hope you've enjoyed exploring his ideas and that you'll continue to engage with his work and the questions he raised.